Imagine you've spent like your entire life scanning the horizon for an invading army, you know?
Right, yeah. Like you're constantly on guard.
Exactly. You're standing on the walls of your city, you're watching the borders, reading the news every single morning, just desperately looking for a dictator rising to power in some foreign country.
You've got the binoculars pressed right to your eyes.
Yes. And then someone taps you on the shoulder and says, uh, you're looking the wrong way. The dictator isn't coming over the hill. The dictator is already inside your own head.
I mean, it completely shatters the paradigm, doesn't it?
It really does.
It takes this grand, cosmic, geopolitical terror that people expect and just, well, it shrinks it down to the most uncomfortably intimate space possible.
It's terrifying, honestly. And that is exactly where we are starting today. Today's source material takes one of the oldest, most terrifying prophetic concepts in religious history, and it basically turns it into a mirror.
Yeah, a very harsh mirror.
Welcome to the deep dive. We are taking you through a highly intricate, religiously and culturally focused essay, and it's titled The Lawless One in the Temple, The Crucified Life.
And it is quite a read.
Oh, it's incredibly dense. So our mission for you today is to deeply analyze, unpack, and really map out this author's complex theological framework. Because this text takes eschatological prophecy, those fiery end-of-the-world predictions that people usually associate with, like charts and timelines.
Right, the stuff you see in movies.
Exactly. And it completely redefines it as a present-day psychological and moral battleground.
And I think it's important to note that it's a very demanding framework.
Yeah.
It's asking the reader to abandon centuries of traditional interpretation and look at the text through a wildly different, deeply personal lens.
Very personal.
Yeah, and it also touches on some of the most sensitive live wire nerves of our modern cultural discourse.
Which means, before we go a single step further, we really need to plant a massive, unavoidable flag right here at the start. This source material contains highly polarized, politically and religiously charged arguments, specifically regarding LGBTQ+ pride, the nature of sexual desire, and modern cultural identities.
It goes right for the cultural third rail.
It really does.
Mm.
So we want to state absolutely clearly to you, the listener, that the purpose of this deep dive is not to endorse or condemn the viewpoints of this text.
Right.
We are not taking a political side. We are not taking a religious side here. We are treating this essay purely as an ideological artifact.
Yeah, our role is entirely analytical today. We are essentially intellectual cartographers, right?
Yeah.
Our job is to impartially convey and examine the philosophical and theological architecture that the author has built.
We're just looking at the blueprints.
Exactly. We want you to understand the mechanics of the argument, like how the author connects their scriptural points and the logic they use to arrive at their conclusions, regardless of whether you personally agree with those conclusions or, find them deeply objectionable.
We are here to map the maze, not tell you whether or not to live in it.
I like that.
So we're going to explore this central provocative premise. What if the apocalyptic lawless one taking over the temple, which is a concept that theologians have fought over for literally centuries, isn't a future political tyrant sitting in a stone building in the Middle East?
Right. What if it's not a geopolitical event at all?
Yeah. What if, instead, the lawless one is the human ego, and the temple it is seizing control of is the individual human body? Okay, let's unpack this, because we have to start with the foundational texts the author is using to make this massive pivot.
Well, to understand the pivot, you really first have to understand what the author is pivoting away from, right?
Right. What's the baseline?
So the traditional battleground for this concept is the biblical book of 2 Thessalonians, specifically chapter 2. For context, in that passage, the writer talks about a man of sin, or a son of perdition, who opposes God, exalts himself above everything that is worshipped, and actually sits in the temple of God, showing himself to be God.
And for generations, readers have treated that passage like a literal architectural blueprint or a political prophecy.
Absolutely.
If you look at the history of how this text has been used, it's wild. I mean, people pointed to the Roman Emperor Nero in the 1st century.
Yep. And later on, the reformers pointed to the Pope.
Right. And in modern times, people are looking for a singular political monster who will somehow orchestrate a global treaty, walk through the doors of a physical third temple built of stone in Jerusalem, and demand worship.
Basically, they are waiting for a headline.
They're waiting for breaking news.
Yeah. But the author of our source text argues that looking for that external geographic event is just a fundamental misreading. Like, it misses the blade of the scripture entirely. And so they introduce this concept of what they call the Berean approach.
Okay, I want to pause there for a second because that's a term that might be completely foreign to someone who didn't grow up immersed in biblical studies. What does Berean actually mean in this specific context?
Ah, right. It's a reference to a specific group of people mentioned in the book of Acts, the Bereans. The text commends them because they didn't just passively accept the teachings they were given at surface value.
They did their homework.
Exactly. They searched the scriptures daily and deeply to investigate whether those teachings were actually true. So when the author uses the term Berean, they are advocating for a deeper, more investigative reading of the text, one that looks past the sensationalist headlines and the obsession with literal stone walls.
And part of that deeper reading involves cross-referencing, right? Because the author brings in another verse, 1 John 2.18, which explicitly says, even now are there many antichrists. And the author really seizes on that word, many.
Yeah, that pluralization changes the entire trajectory of the theology. Because if there are many antichrists, and if they were already present in the first century when John was writing, then this threat cannot simply be one guy in a tailored suit signing a treaty at the end of human history.
It's a pattern.
Exactly. It is an ongoing spiritual operation that the text refers to as the mystery of iniquity.
So if this operation is happening right now and has been happening for thousands of years, the immediate question you have to ask is, where is it taking place? Where is this temple? And I feel like this is the hinge of the entire essay.
It really is.
Because the author brings in 1 Corinthians 6.1d, in which says, what? Know ye not that your body is the temple of the Holy Ghost?
Yes. By connecting Thessalonians directly to Corinthians, the author argues that the temple is anatomical. It is spiritual. It is the individual human being.
The crisis isn't taking place on a geopolitical stage. It is a personal, bodily, and moral crisis.
Right down to the individual.
Let me make sure I'm visualizing this correctly. The lawlessness isn't a dictator passing a terrible law. The lawlessness is the self, my ego, your ego seating itself in the human mind and body, right in the inner sanctuary where God is supposed to reside.
Yeah.
And it's claiming the ultimate authority to define what is good and what is evil.
That is the exact mechanism they're describing. The self becomes its own God in its own bodily temple. The author is arguing that the ultimate act of rebellion isn't, worshiping a golden calf or some ancient statue.
It's worshiping the mirror.
It's worshiping the mirror, exactly.
It makes me think of an analogy. Imagine you live in a house and you are absolutely terrified of being robbed. You hear rumors of this legendary burglar who is going to come and take everything.
So you panic.
Right. You spend an absolute fortune installing this massive state-of-the-art security system.
Yeah.
You've got high-definition cameras pointing at the street.
You've got motion sensors lighting up the lawn every time a leaf blows.
Exactly. You put barbed wire on the fences. You've got laser grids on the windows. You are sitting in your living room staring at a wall of monitors 24/7, just waiting for this legendary threat to show up on the perimeter.
Just hyper-fixated on the screens.
Yes, but because you are so focused on the screens, you are completely ignoring the fact that the intruder has already bypassed the cameras. The intruder is currently sitting on your sofa, drinking your coffee, wearing your favorite sweater, and calmly explaining to you that they actually own the house now.
And you are still staring at the screen, looking for the threat.
Yeah.
I mean, that perfectly captures the author's sense of tragic irony here. Humanity is looking out the window for the Antichrist, while the ego is comfortably drinking coffee in the living room of the soul.
Wow.
The author is saying that if the body is a temple, then none of your internal experiences are merely private matters. Your desires, your intellect, your political leanings, they're all priestly matters. The ultimate question the text asks is, who currently holds the seat in the inner sanctuary?
And the text is incredibly stark about the answer to that question. If the Holy Spirit is supposed to occupy that seat, then the self cannot be the Lord.
Right, there's only one seat.
If your sexual identity, your bank account, your racial heritage, or even your own religious self-righteousness sits in that seat, the temple is occupied by an idol, and that idol's name is always me.
Which naturally forces us to examine the architecture of this takeover. If the temple is the individual person, what is the precise mechanism that allows this intruder, the ego, to confidently take over the living room and demand control?
This brings us to the author's redefinition of a word we use every single day, and that word is pride.
Yeah, but not just pride as a general concept.
Right, but what the author specifically calls the twofold abomination.
To follow the author's logic here, we have to completely strip away the modern colloquial understanding of the word pride. Because in our everyday language, pride is usually seen as a positive or at least a benign emotion.
Like being proud of your kid's spelling bee.
Exactly. It might mean feeling a sense of accomplishment because you worked hard for a promotion, or looking at a piece of art you created, or, crucially in modern psychology, it means feeling a sense of relief because you are no longer deeply ashamed of who you are.
It's viewed as the opposite of toxic shame.
Right. But the text argues that pride, when spiritually understood through this biblical lens, is significantly darker and far more active. It is not just a feeling of happiness, it is the literal active enthronement of the self as the ultimate moral reference point in the universe.
It's setting yourself up as the judge.
Yeah. The author actually puts words in the mouth of this spiritual concept of pride to illustrate its posture. The text says, pride speaks like this: I am the reference point. I am the truth of myself. I am the moral authority. I define love. I define righteousness.
It is the human being treating themselves as an infallible compass.
Exactly.
And to ground this definition scripturally, the author builds this concept of the twofold abomination. Now, this part is fascinating because it's like a very specific kind of theological math.
That's a good way to put it.
They pull from two very different parts of the Old Testament. First, they look at Leviticus 18.22. This is part of the ancient civil and moral code of Israel, and it condemns a specific sexual act, same-sex relations, by its function.
Yes, and traditionally, many theologians stop right there. They point to the code and say, the act is forbidden.
End of story.
Right. But the author layers that civil code with wisdom literature. They bring in Proverbs 16.5, which states, everyone that is proud in heart is an abomination to the Lord.
This is a crucial distinction. The author is pointing out that the text calls the proud heart itself an abomination, completely independent of any physical action.
Exactly.
You don't have to do anything physical to commit the second abomination. It is purely the posture of making yourself a god. It's the arrogance of the spirit.
Precisely. So the twofold abomination occurs when these two distinct streams merge into a single cultural river. You have a sexual order that the text views as condemned by its very function, and it merges with the condemned spiritual posture of self-exaltation, the proud heart.
They lock together.
Yes. The author asserts that the core existential crisis isn't simply that a prohibited desire exists within a person. The text acknowledges that human beings have all sorts of desires. The real crisis, the apocalyptic crisis, is that this specific desire is publicly crowned, proudly defended, and demands moral affirmation from the rest of society.
And this is where the text explicitly turns its focus onto the LGBTQ+ movement, framing it as the public forerunner of this lawless pattern.
What's fascinating here is how the author completely dismisses and ignores all modern terminology.
Oh, totally.
They don't use sociological terms. They argue that divine judgment assesses based on function, act, and the posture of the heart, completely bypassing modern acronyms like LGBTQ+ or corporate branding phrases that were invented centuries after these texts were written.
So they're looking past the modern labels.
Right. The argument posits that divine judgment doesn't need a corporate HR flag or a Supreme Court ruling to recognize what it considers a disorder. It looks strictly at the foundational function and whether the heart is demanding worship for that function.
But I have to stop you there and push back on behalf of the listener because there is a glaring question here.
Okay, let's hear it.
If the author truly believes that this lawless pattern of self-enthronement is a universal human flaw, if they believe that an intellectual can do it with their mind, or a rich man can do it with his money, why does this text hyperfixate on the LGBTQ+ movement specifically?
That's a fair question.
Why dedicate an entire theological framework to this one demographic if the sin is universal? It feels, well, disproportionate.
It is a vital question to ask, and it is a critique the author seems to anticipate, and they attempt to answer it using the internal logic of their own framework.
Yeah.
The text points to the literal name that the movement has chosen for itself.
The name.
Yeah. The author argues that the LGBTQ+ movement is uniquely focused on because it explicitly, loudly names itself pride.
Oh, wow. So it's the branding that triggers the theological alarm.
It's the branding, but more importantly, it's what that branding demands. The author argues that this movement doesn't just ask to be left alone behind closed doors. It doesn't just ask for basic tolerance. According to the text, it enforces a public societal catechism. It demands that the broader culture The education system, the legal system, and the very language we use all adapt to affirm this specific identity as fundamentally morally good.
It wants institutional buy-in.
Exactly. It is the public, inescapable nature of the demand for worshipful affirmation that makes it the forerunner in the author's eyes. It is pride demanding that the rest of the world bow to its definition of reality.
I see. It's the transition from a private internal struggle or a private identity into a mandated public liturgy. If you just have a private flaw, that's one thing. But if you demand that the government and the schools throw a parade for your flaw, the author sees that as the mystery of iniquity operating out in the open.
That is the exact distinction the author is drawing. And that demand for public affirmation moves our discussion perfectly from the realm of personal internal pride into how this pride manipulates and restructures broader cultural institutions.
Because to enforce a new catechism, you have to change the language. You have to change the definitions of words.
You rewrite the dictionary.
Yes, and this brings us to the author's reliance on the prophet Isaiah, specifically Isaiah 5.2a, which really serves as the cornerstone for understanding the entire cultural critique within this essay.
The verse reads, "Woe unto them that call evil good and good evil, that put darkness for light and light for darkness."
It's so poetic, but so intense.
It is. The author takes this ancient prophetic grammar, which was originally directed at a corrupt ancient Israel, and maps it directly onto what they see as a modern cultural reversal.
The argument is that society isn't just turning a blind eye to sin anymore. Like, tolerating something you believe is wrong is passive. What Isaiah is describing and what the author says is happening now is active. It is actively renaming reality.
The manipulation of language is the central mechanism of this cultural shift. The author argues that the true danger to a society isn't just that sin exists. Sin has always existed. Human beings have always been flawed. The existential danger arises when sin gains a vocabulary, a liturgy, and institutional protection. The text points out that in the modern lexicon, disorder is being aggressively renamed as love, the act of moral correction is being rebranded as hate, and fundamental rebellion against divine design is being elevated to the status of identity.
It is a complete and total moral inversion. You take the dictionary and you literally flip it upside down. And the text makes a really sharp, almost legal distinction between civil law, the laws made by human governments, and divine law.
Yes, they don't see them as the same at all.
Not at all. The author argues that just because a parliament or a Congress passes a law protecting a certain class of people, that legal protection does absolutely nothing to make that identity holy before God.
The phrase that really anchors this section of the essay is, "The state does not define holiness."
That's a strong line.
It is. The author is pushing back against the modern assumption that legality equals morality. A multinational corporation can fly a flag during a specific month, a Supreme Court can hand down a landmark ruling, a school board can change its curriculum. But the text insists that while man has the power to legally protect a category, God retains the sole authority to judge the posture.
Right. The state's stamp of approval doesn't change the spiritual reality.
The applause of the crowd does not rewrite the laws of physics,
Yeah.
and it certainly doesn't rewrite divine truth.
Which leads the author to tackle what is arguably the most potent, universally recognized visual symbol of this entire cultural shift, and that is the repurposing of the rainbow.
To analyze this, the author goes all the way back to the book of Genesis, specifically Genesis 9.13, which is the narrative of Noah's Ark.
Sunday school classic.
Exactly. Now, in the biblical account, after the global flood, God sets the rainbow in the cloud. Within that specific theological narrative, the rainbow is explicitly designated as a sign of covenant mercy.
It's a promise.
Yes. It is a visual promise of divine restraint after a period of intense cataclysmic judgment. It is a symbol that fundamentally belongs to God.
But the author observes that modern culture has taken this specific, deeply sacred divine covenant sign and entirely repurposed it. It has been transformed into a banner of self-affirmation and what the text calls fleshly pride.
Right.
Let's build an analogy to understand the sheer audacity of this from the author's perspective. Imagine a massive, historic company that was founded with a very specific, noble mission. A hostile corporate takeover happens, new management comes in, and they utterly despise the original founder.
They want nothing to do with him.
Right, they oust him. But they don't just quietly change the company rules or the product line.
They actually keep the founder's original logo, the very symbol that represented the founder's noble mission.
Yes. They keep the logo, but they use it to mass produce and sell the exact opposite product. They use the founder's trusted emblem to market something the founder explicitly forbade. They wave the founder's flag while using the profits to dismantle the founder's house.
I mean, that captures the profound sense of spiritual theft the author is articulating. The text contains this striking parallel. God set the bow in the cloud, man waves the bow over the flesh.
Wow.
The author is framing the modern use of the pride flag not merely as a colorful, inclusive design choice, but as a direct, intentional, and almost taunting theological reversal.
It's an affront.
Yeah, it is the act of taking a symbol that meant God will have mercy on our corruption
Yes.
and waving it as a statement of, we take pride in our corruption. It's an ideological hijacking.
I want to stop for a second because, for you listening, this is an incredibly heavy, unyielding framework we are unpacking. The author is essentially demanding a complete destruction of the foundational tenets of modern identity politics.
They're pulling up the floorboards.
They really are. And looking at it from a secular or modern psychological perspective, this leads to a massive friction point. This deep dive into cultural messaging and symbols naturally crashes right into the most common, deeply felt, and widely accepted defense of these identities. And that is the argument of being born this way.
It is the emotional and psychological bedrock of the modern identity movement.
Absolutely.
And the logic is compelling, right? If I didn't consciously choose to feel this way, if this desire was present before I even understood what it was, how can it possibly be morally wrong?
It feels incredibly unfair.
Yeah, people ask, how can a just God condemn me for a factory setting I didn't select?
It is a question of intent and origin. We place so much moral weight on choice. If an action is involuntary, we usually excuse it. But the author decides to attack this defense head-on, completely refusing to accept the premise that lack of choice equals innocence.
The author posits a deeply uncomfortable theological truth. They argue that whether a desire is consciously chosen or entirely unchosen is completely irrelevant to its holiness.
That is a jagged pill for the modern mind to swallow. We want our biology to be our justification.
You do. We want authenticity to be the ultimate moral good. Like, if it's true to me, it must be good. But the author counters that a desire being unchosen doesn't miraculously make it righteous. A desire being deeply, genuinely felt in your bones doesn't make it a God worthy of worship. The text insists that historic Orthodox Christianity has never, ever taught self-discovery as the gospel.
That is such a crucial distinction. Modern culture says, look inward, find the truest, most authentic version of your desires, and then express them outwardly and demand the world celebrate them.
Exactly. But the author says the biblical mandate is the exact opposite. The text doesn't say express yourself. It teaches death and resurrection. The ultimate mandate given by Christ in the Gospels is, except a man be born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God.
Born this way versus born again. It's an incredibly stark binary.
It couldn't be more opposed.
One philosophy says your first birth, your biological and psychological factory settings are sacred and must be affirmed. The other philosophy says your first birth is inherently corrupted and must be put to death so a second spiritual birth can happen.
Yes, it's a complete override of the system.
But I have to ask you, as someone analyzing this text, how does the author deal with the visceral reality of unchosen desires? Because it feels like an incredibly cruel and heavy moral burden to place on an individual, telling them that the core feelings they've had since childhood, feelings they never asked for and perhaps prayed to have removed, are not just wrong, but are part of this apocalyptic mystery of iniquity. How does the author reconcile that burden?
The author attempts to reconcile it by drawing a very hard, absolute line between the arising of a desire and what the will actively does with that desire once it arises.
Okay, unpack that for me.
The text acknowledges the reality of the human condition. It anticipates the objection where someone says, I didn't choose to have this specific attraction. I didn't ask for this struggle.
And what is the author's response to that?
The author basically says, fine, let's concede that you didn't choose the desire, but you absolutely choose what you are proud of.
Oh, I see.
The involuntary feeling isn't the focal point of the final condemnation. The condemnation falls on the crowning of that feeling. You may not have chosen the attraction, but you choose to buy the flag.
You choose to march in the parade.
You choose to write the public essay demanding that others affirm it. You choose to make it the cornerstone of your identity.
Okay, I see the mechanics of the argument now. It's like the uninvited guest shows up in the living room of the temple.
Yeah.
You didn't invite the guest, but you are the one who chooses whether to fight the guest or to serve them coffee, hand them the deed to the house, and tell all your neighbors how wonderful the guest is.
Exactly. Does the will submit the unchosen desire to the cross for crucifixion, or does the will parade the desire and demand worshipful affirmation from the culture?
It's all about the response.
Yes. And to explain this dynamic, the author introduces what we can call the stewardship principle. They lean heavily on two scriptures. First, Ephesians 2:10, which says, "We are God's workmanship, created for good works, prepared beforehand."
And second, Deuteronomy 30.19, where God sets before the people life and death, blessing and cursing, and commands them to choose life.
If I'm tracking the author's logic here, the underlying idea is that man does not originate goodness. We are not self-contained moral universes. We are not the source of our own meaning or our own righteousness. We are just stewards.
That's the perfect word for it.
Let's think about ancient stewardship. A master leaves a servant in charge of an estate. The servant doesn't own the land, the house, or the crops. Their job is solely to maintain it according to the master's rules until the master returns.
Right.
If the servant suddenly declares, "I am the owner now and I will burn the crops because I feel like it," that is a fundamental breach of reality. The author is mapping that onto the human body. We receive life as a loan, and we have to choose to give the temple back to the true owner, which means actively dismantling the ego rather than building a throne for it. That's a very accurate reading of the text's philosophy. The author explicitly states, life is not the flesh crowning itself. In this theological framework, to truly choose life as commanded in Deuteronomy is to violently refuse the throne of the self.
But this brings up a logistical question about how human societies operate. If this act of self-enthronement, this pride, is so heavily condemned by the author, and if defeating it requires such a painful daily crucifixion of the ego, how does it spread so successfully?
The transmission of culture.
Yeah. How does a philosophy of rebellion become the default, unquestioned setting for entire generations of people?
That question moves our analysis into how the author views cultural reproduction. To explain this rapid spread, the author links our current cultural moment back to the days of Noah from Genesis chapter 6.
Okay, Genesis again.
Yeah, the text zeroes in on a very specific phrase from that ancient narrative regarding the state of humanity before the flood. Men of renown.
Now, in the ancient literal context of Genesis, those were often interpreted as literal giants or great warriors or tyrannical kings who dominated the ancient world through physical force.
Right, the Nephilim. But the author modernizes this concept.
So who are the men of renown today?
The author extracts the principle from the ancient setting. Today's men of renown aren't wielding swords. The text defines them as modern celebrities, massive social media influencers, politicians, and what it brilliantly terms corporate prophets. You know, the HR departments, the marketing executives, the media conglomerates.
The people controlling the algorithms.
Exactly. These are the figures who possess the immense power to shape the moral imagination of a society.
They are the ones who normalize desire for the youth. They take what the text considers profound spiritual corruption and they package it as style. They turn rebellion into a highly marketable identity.
And here's where the author introduces a truly fascinating sociological concept wrapped in theology, the idea of ideological reproduction.
Here's where it gets really interesting, folks.
It really does. The author argues that reproduction is not strictly a biological function. To illustrate this, the text dives into the concept of a genia. It's a Greek word often translated in the New Testament as generation, but the author expands its definition to describe a civilizational, juridical, or ideological lineage.
Let's really break that down because it's a dense concept.
Yeah.
When we say a civilization reproduces, what does that actually look like?
The author uses the ancient Roman Empire as the prime example. Rome didn't conquer the known world and maintain its grip for centuries just by having a high birth rate among Roman citizens in Italy.
Right. They didn't just outpopulate everyone.
No, Rome reproduced its genia, its civilizational identity, through systems.
Right. If Rome conquered a province in Gaul or North Africa, they built Roman roads, they instituted Roman law, the paterfamilias system of family governance was enforced.
The whole social structure.
Yes, the people had to learn Latin to conduct business. Within a few generations, people who had zero biological Roman blood were functionally ideologically Roman. The empire reproduced through its institutions.
Precisely. And the author takes that historical reality and maps it directly onto the modern pride movement. The argument is that biological sex produces physical children and genetic bloodlines. But ideologies, build empires.
And they don't need biology to do it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And pride, as an ideology, reproduces itself not through physical loins, but through the modern equivalents of Roman roads and Roman laws.
Yeah.
So we're talking about public school curriculums, shifting the definitions of words in the dictionary, the algorithms of entertainment, corporate diversity policies, and civil legislation.
The quote from the text that really hammers this home is, "The loins introduce the seed, but the culture reproduces the doctrine."
That's a powerful line.
It is. The author is saying that the physical body might introduce the lust or the unchosen desire, but it's the mind, the media, and the culture that elevate that desire and enthrone its meaning. The biological urge introduces the pattern, but the broader moral imagination of society builds the throne and demands that everyone bow to it.
It's an argument that the real battleground for the future of humanity isn't anatomy, it's worship. It's a battle over who possesses the authority to define what is good. Who gets to define what constitutes a legitimate human identity?
And to try and prove the inherent hypocrisy of how modern secular society currently answers those profound questions, the author uses a highly provocative and frankly very jarring comparison.
Yes, this part is intense.
It is. This brings us to a section of the text that requires very careful handling: the identity machine and the sex offender analogy.
Before we delve into the mechanics of this argument, we need to issue another critical safety and neutrality check.
Please do.
The author explicitly and clearly condemns coercion, abuse, exploitation, and rape. The text states plainly that those acts are undeniably wicked and must be judged. The author is absolutely not defending, minimizing, or equating consensual relationships with abuse.
Thank you for making that explicit. It is crucial context for the listener. So, with that understood and firmly in place, what is the author actually trying to accomplish with this side door argument? Why use such an extreme and sensitive legal category?
The author is using an extreme contrast to expose the internal inconsistency of what they call man's identity machine.
Okay, how so?
The text asks the reader to observe how modern society treats different categories of sexual desire. On one hand, society is perfectly comfortable taking certain types of sexual desire in conduct, specifically those that are coercive or abusive, and permanently branding the individuals who commit them.
Right.
We create legal categories like sex offender. We put them on public registries. We restrict where they can live and work.
In other words, society takes a specific sexual conduct and permanently attaches it to a person's identity in a deeply negative, restrictive, and shameful way. The society agrees that this specific expression of the flesh is a permanent stain.
Exactly. But then, the author points out, that very same society turns around, looks at another category of sexual conduct and desire, and does the exact opposite.
A complete 180.
Yes, instead of a registry, it crowns this conduct with the title of pride. It demands that this identity not only be tolerated, but actively celebrated with parades, corporate sponsorships, and educational mandates.
If we connect this to the bigger picture the author is trying to paint, they are using this extreme contrast to argue that humanity's system for labeling moral right and wrong is entirely chaotic.
It has no anchor.
Right. It is based entirely on political convenience and shifting cultural moods rather than objective truth.
The text argues that man happily turns conduct into a permanent, shameful identity when society decides it wants condemnation, and man turns conduct into a sacred, untouchable identity when society decides it wants celebration. The identity machine is driven by the crowd, not by a consistent moral law.
And the author contrasts this chaotic human machinery with their view of divine judgment. The text argues that God judges consistently based on eternal truth, covenant design, and the need for spiritual repair.
God doesn't need a poll to decide what's right.
Exactly. God doesn't need a modern stigma machine, a sex offender registry, or a pride parade to know the difference between righteousness and unrighteousness. God names the breach of the law, and God names the remedy through the cross. The author's point is that God isn't confused about identity. Man is.
Well said. Now, having delivered this massive, unsparing critique of the modern culture at large, you might expect the essay to just end there.
Yeah, drop the mic and walk away.
Right. You might expect the author to ride high on a wave of condemnation, pointing the finger outward at the pride parades and the corporate profits, and letting the religious reader feel incredibly smug and secure.
Like, look at those terrible people over there.
Exactly. But the author does something brilliant and terrifying here. Instead of ending with outward condemnation, the author takes the blade they just used to dissect the culture and turns it entirely inward, aiming it directly at the chest of the reader.
Wow. This brings us to the concept of the universal mirror.
Yes.
The author emphatically insists that no one gets to just be a righteous spectator to someone else's rebellion. No one gets to sit in the balcony and throw stones.
The math is brutal.
It really is. If the individual human body is the temple, and there are roughly 8 billion human bodies walking the earth right now, that means there are 8 billion temples. And the author asserts that, by default, every single one of those temples is occupied by an idol.
The text makes it abundantly clear that LGBTQ+ pride is just one manifestation of this core human problem. It might be viewed as a public forerunner because of its specific name and its demands for cultural liturgy, but it absolutely does not have a monopoly on the lawless pattern.
Not even close.
The author spends significant time listing where else this exact same spirit of self-deifying pride sits in the modern world.
Let's run through that list because the author spares absolutely no one. It is an equal opportunity indictment.
Oh, they go after everybody.
They really do. The text says this exact same pride sits in a straight man's lust, convincing him his biological urges justify his actions. It sits in a preacher who loves the sound of his own voice and the authority of his pulpit more than the God he claims to serve.
It sits in the politician who views himself as the indispensable savior of his nation.
Yep.
It sits in the fierce patriot who subtly begins to worship their own country, their flag, or their political party over the kingdom of God.
It sits in the intellectual who worships their own mind and their ability to deconstruct texts. It sits in the professional victim who worships their own historical grievance and uses it as a shield against any personal accountability.
That's a sharp one.
And it even sits in the highly religious person who goes to church every Sunday, sings the songs, says, "Lord, Lord," but absolutely refuses to crucify their own ego in private.
It's a devastating leveling of the moral playing field. Everyone is exposed.
It makes me think of the story of the Trojan horse. Imagine a city under siege. All the religious and conservative citizens are standing on the massive stone walls of their city looking outward.
Man, the barricades.
Right. They are heavily armed, pointing their arrows at the LGBTQ+ movement, the secular culture, the media, thinking they are bravely defending the faith from the enemy outside.
And they are completely oblivious.
Completely oblivious to the fact that they've already wheeled their own specific wooden horse right through the front gates.
It's already inside.
They've brought their own bespoke, custom-tailored brand of pride right into their own temple. They are fiercely guarding the exterior walls, totally unaware that the enemy is already inside the city, waiting for nightfall to burn it to the ground.
That is exactly the dynamic the author is attacking. And this is how the text anticipates and answers the classic plank in the eye objection. You know, the famous teaching of Jesus warning hypocrites not to judge the tiny speck in someone else's eye while ignoring the massive wooden plank in their own eye.
Right. In modern discourse, people usually use that verse as a conversational kill switch. They use it to mean, we are all flawed, so no one should ever judge anyone else, and we should all just be quiet and tolerate everything.
Right. It's used to shut down moral judgment entirely. But the author argues that the Orthodox Christian response to the plank in the eye isn't silence or passive tolerance. The correct response is witness from under the same cross.
That's a huge shift in perspective.
The author writes this incredibly potent line. If there is a plank in my eye, let it be the cross. I do not say only your pride must be crucified. I say mine must be crucified first.
It is a demand for the shared mutual destruction of the human ego. You cannot preach crucifixion to the culture if your own ego is sitting comfortably on a throne.
You have to bleed first.
Exactly. This brings the text to its emotional and theological climax, leaning heavily on the Apostle Paul's words in Galatians 2:3. I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me.
And the author pairs that with the harsh words of Luke 14:26, where Christ says, a true disciple must hate his own life.
Which is a very tough verse to read.
It is. But the author argues forcefully that these are not metaphors.
Yeah.
They are not commands for petty cruelty, self-harm, or toxic self-hatred. They are the absolute, non-negotiable, functional requirements to kill the ego so that the Holy Spirit can actually live in the temple.
The author totally redefines the phrase, I am not proud. In our modern therapeutic context, if someone says, I am not proud, it sounds like a pathology.
Like they need a hug.
Right. It sounds like they have dangerously low self-esteem or are suffering from toxic shame that needs to be healed by a therapist. But the author frames, I am not proud as the highest possible temple language.
Yes. When the believer says, I am not proud in this framework, it means I do not enthrone my flesh. I do not worship my unchosen desires. I do not worship my political identity. I do not seat my ego in the temple and call it God. I have vacated the seat.
Which brings us to the monumental task of synthesizing this entire dense, uncompromising, and incredibly challenging text. How do we pull all of these complex moving parts from ancient Thessalonians to modern HR departments together?
Well, the core, undeniable takeaway of this text is that the ultimate defining division in humanity is not what we think it is. It is not straight versus gay.
Right.
It is not conservative versus liberal. It is not religious versus secular. To the author, those categories are dangerously small and deceptive. The true cosmic division is pride versus crucifixion.
It is the monumental clash between the dominant modern mantra, express yourself, find your truth, you were born this way, demand affirmation, and the ancient theological mandate to deny yourself, submit to objective truth, and be born again.
The text leaves absolutely no middle ground for the reader to stand on. It is a total, uncompromising war between self-enthronement and Christ enthroned. You are either crowning the self or you are crucifying it.
So what does this all mean for us sitting here right now? We've traced the author's relentless argument from the prophecies of Thessalonians to the corporate branding of the modern pride parade.
We covered a lot of ground.
We really did. We've gone from the divine mercy of the repurposed rainbow to the universal mirror, where every single listener's own ego is violently implicated. We've seen how the author views the terrifying, lawless one, not as a distant politician in a suit, but as the deeply familiar idol of me sitting comfortably in the temple of your own body.
Yeah.
And that leaves me with a final lingering thought for you, the listener, to mull over as you go about the rest of your day. It's a question that builds on the foundation of this source material, but pushes it out of the realm of theology and into the harsh reality of how we actually function in the 21st century.
I'm intrigued.
Well, the author sets up this stark, unyielding binary. On one side, you have express yourself, which the text defines as the sin of self-enthronement. On the other side, you have deny yourself, which is the required crucifixion of the ego.
Right.
But I want you to look around at the actual physical world we inhabit right now. Consider that our entire modern digital economy, the fundamental structures of our social media, our career networking platforms like LinkedIn, the way we apply for jobs, the way we date, the way we are told to exist in a public space, it is all fundamentally structurally built on the absolute necessity of expressing yourself and building a highly curated personal brand.
Oh, no. Yeah.
Your digital footprint is your resume. Your curated identity is your social currency. Your ability to project yourself into the world is how you survive.
You literally have to sell yourself.
Exactly. So the provocative question is this. In an era where the literal machinery of human society requires you to constantly market, project, and elevate yourself just to participate in the economy, is it even functionally possible to live the author's version of the crucified life in public today without completely opting out of the modern world and moving to a cabin in the woods?
That is a staggering thought.
Can you be a ghost in a machine that is built entirely on the worship of personal branding?
It is an immense, almost paralyzing question. It essentially asks if the very architecture of the modern digital world has made the theology of this text practically impossible to execute without becoming a total exile.
And it brings us right back to where we started. We wanted a clear, comforting X-ray. We wanted a clean architectural blueprint that showed us the bad guy standing in a stone temple somewhere far, far away across the ocean. But instead, the text hands us a mirror and tells us that the temple is us and the intruder is already sitting in the living room.
Drinking the coffee.
Drinking the coffee. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us. Until next time.